Hello, you made it to the last video about this poetry series. In this video, we will be revising the poem by John Agard, Checking Out Me History. This poem really explores the theme of identity and the way historical education can omit significant Black figures and the impact that can have on then those learning history. The speaker passionately questions why his Caribbean heritage was sidelined while European narratives, the Eurocentric narrative, dominated his education, and the impact that therefore can have on one's identity. We'll think about the context, we will annotate it in detail, paying attention to language and form, and think about which other poems in the collection we could compare it to. By the end of this video, you will have a better understanding of this poem and be able to approach your exam with more confidence and be able to draw comparisons with the others in the series. So make sure you stay until the end.
Them tell me what they want to tell me. Bandage up my eye with my own history, blind me to my own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. But to St. Louis, but you know, them never tell me about that. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me the dish run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the Maroon. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shagga the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and she lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. Them tell me what they want to tell me. But now I checking out me own history. I carving out me identity.
So, what is this poem about? What's the plot of this poem? In this poem, the speaker laments the injustice of the unbalanced version of history he was taught that blinded him to his own identity as he was growing up. Throughout the poem, he lists Black hidden figures about whom he was never taught. Instead, he was only ever fed British history or a Eurocentric history. So it exposes this colonial history that was imposed upon the speaker and calls it out. And it heightens the injustice that there was this other history that the speaker was deprived of. The ending, though, is more optimistic. Only when the speaker checks out, appreciates, or learns about this past cultural heritage that was hidden from him can he carve out his own identity. But he can. He is reclaiming his identity and carving out this new identity at the end of the poem. Let's think a bit about the context. Checking Out My History was published in 2005 in John Agard's collection Half Caste and Other Poems. Now, Agard was born in Guyana and he received this colonial education that he writes about in the poem. When he saw a school textbook that claimed West Indian history began with Columbus, it really resonated. And that's what he's exploring then in this poem, this omission of his own cultural heritage that was denied him in the educational system, the colonial educational system. So it highlights the British-centric teaching he experienced growing up. So this poem challenges the marginalization of Black history and culture, reflecting a broader post-colonial struggle for identity recognition and cultural pride. Let's look in more detail at the poem. So, throughout the poem, you have this repeated, somewhat ominous "dem tell me." And it's both repetition and anaphora because it's at the beginning of many of the lines. Remember, anaphora is a type of repetition that happens at the beginning of a line, clause, or sentence. So, what is the effect of this repeated "dem tell me" throughout? It highlights the oppressive nature of this imposed colonial education on the speaker. He didn't have any control over the education that he was fed in school. And actually saying, them tell me, them tell me, dem tell me. It's both accusing those who taught him the history, but also it has quite an ominous effect because it seems so relentless. And throughout, Dem tell me, bandage up me eye, he is both in the vocabulary and also in the spelling. He is phonetically capturing the Creole dialect, this Caribbean dialect. And that has more than one effect. It both reflects the cultural pride, but it also strikes a somewhat defiant tone, using the spelling and language to break away from the standard conventions and the colonial traditions of this education he was fed. I find this a really interesting line, what Dem want to tell me. It raises questions about how history is taught. How history is taught is a really fascinating question. And I'm sure you've heard of the expression that history is written by the victors. Those who win wars are those who determine how their history is taught. And those who lose the wars are the ones who are almost written over in history. For example, it would be fascinating to compare how the Second World War is taught in places like Germany as opposed to somewhere like the USA or the UK. And there is a level, even though history should be dispassionate, detached, and completely accurate, there is a subjectivity in how it is packaged and delivered. And so when I say something that is subjective, it can be influenced by personal feelings or opinions. So there is a level of subjectivity about the teaching of history that shouldn't necessarily be there. And also, as I said, it's a means of controlling. What Dem want to tell me? They're teaching the children a censored version of history that they want the children to receive. Bandage up me eye, blind me. This is quite violent imagery. This idea of being bandaged and blinded to one's own identity. And what is the effect of that violent imagery? So it exposes the cruelty and injustice of withholding history from somebody, of hiding from them parts of their own cultural heritage, and therefore potentially blighting or quelling their own developing identity, not allowing them to reach their full potential, not allowing them to develop their identity in a way that they would have if they were aware of their own cultural heritage. And there is a real injustice to this imbalanced, asymmetrical colonial history that was forced down the throats of these young students. Okay, so you have these short stanzas and then you have this long stanza. Throughout the whole poem, you have a dual structure. So you have the short stanzas of the official colonial history, dates like 1066, the Battle of Hastings, that we all learn about in school. And then you have these long italicized stanzas depicting the Black history of hidden figures who are omitted from, left out of the taught colonial institutionalized histories in school. So someone like Toussaint Louverture, who read the Haitian Revolution, those sorts of figures were denied these young students growing up because they represent perhaps something that's subversive, something that's rebellious. And as we say, there is a cruelty and an injustice in the fact that you learn about figures like Dick Whittington, but you don't hear about figures like Toussaint Louverture. And throughout the poem, there is this musicality and a rhythm that reminds somewhat of oral storytelling. And the oral tradition is when stories are passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. And that's a Caribbean tradition. And there is, in the sort of sing-song musicality of this poem, it is reminiscent of this tradition. I love this one. And the cow who jumped over the moon. For me, his defiant tone really shines through here, because by saying that, by throwing the cow who jumped into the moon with all these talks of other bits of history, one interpretation could be that he's equating colonial history taught in schools to nursery rhymes, to being as insubstantial, as lacking depth. And that then lends a lot more intensity and depth to this italicized Black history that he is now making up for and teaching people about. And again, then you have this interweaving of Black history and official history. And you have these counterparts to the colonial versions. So you have Nelson, who won the Battle of Waterloo, but you're also given the king of the Zulu kingdom. And we're given Florence Nightingale, a famous nurse that everyone learns about. But then we don't learn about Mary Seacole, a British nurse who is just as remarkable, but not remembered in the same way that Florence Nightingale is. And this poem does raise, as I said, fascinating questions about how history is presented and how much power that wields the way that history is presented, how that can shape an individual identity. So, as I say, the whole poem highlights the power that the history that is taught in classrooms, how much power it can wield over the shaping of identity, and then the risk of marginalising these hidden Black figures and omitting them from history, how much that can then affect one's developing identity. And that's the point of this poem. He's reclaiming that identity. And that's why this last stanza is so significant, because there is this hopeful undertone that the speaker is reclaiming power over his identity. But it is only when the speaker checks out, looks into this cultural heritage that was denied him, only then can he carve out his own identity. And here, obviously, there's the contrast. There's the contrast of being blinded to his own identity in the second stanza. And we could also talk about the connotations of carving. To carve, we associate that with shaping something. So rather than being blinded, you now have all of the creative connotations of carving there. And as I said, it's only when he checks out the history of this cultural heritage that was denied him can he carve out his own identity. And in that action of carving out his identity, he is reclaiming power from the colonial education that sought to hide that identity from him. By exploring how identity can be threatened by this historical inaccuracy, by these marginalised figures in history that are kept from the educational system, Agard ultimately stresses the importance of being able to form one's own individual identity and how that is threatened when people seek to withhold one's cultural heritage. It has a very important message at the heart of this poem. But if you notice, it's a much more hopeful tone than many of the other poems in the collection. So what's going on with this poem's structure? Agard employs a non-traditional structure, which is fitting considering the content of the poem. It alternates between short stanzas, official history, and longer stanzas, Black history, emphasising those hidden stories. The lack of punctuation recognises rebellion against standard conventions, and therefore rebellion perhaps against colonial narratives. The rhythmic Creole speech adds a musicality to the poem and emphasises that idea of oral storytelling. There's a sense of defiance in spelling that Creole phonetically because it is, as he's doing in the poem, reclaiming his own identity, and that includes his language. So, which poems could you compare it to? You could compare it to William Blake's London, because both poems are critiquing oppression or different forms of oppression, and both explore restricted freedoms. Obviously, London is a much bleaker poem, whereas checking out in history, you have a much more hopeful tone at the end. You could compare it to the Émigrée, because both explore this idea of identity and the sense of belonging and what is it that forms our identity. And you could also compare it to Tissue. In that, both emphasize identity, heritage, and cultural legacy. I hope that was helpful and that you feel better prepared to approach this poem in your exam. It's a poem with a very different tone and a very different structure to the poems that have come before it. But that's the point. It's rebelling against these standards and conventions. Ultimately, Agard's poem encourages us to examine history more critically. Obviously, how history is delivered in the educational system, it shapes sometimes our views of the world. And so this poem encourages us to question that, to examine that more critically, and to seek our own cultural narratives. That final line that really resonates about carving out one's own identity, it encourages us all to discover, embrace, and proudly share our own unique identity. So keep carving out your own identity, and good luck with the rest of your revision. I really hope your exam goes well.